Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Quick optimized Muslim reminder, inshallah, optimizing the Muslim's mindset for meaningful success in this life and in the hereafter. So this one's about self-reflection and Muhaasabah, or taking yourself to account. At the end of the day, if you have a practice whereby a journaling practice of sorts, or even if you're not writing anything down, writing something down can be helpful because it helps you structure your thoughts. Even in terms of mental health, it's been shown to help alleviate some of the negative symptoms of anxiety or things like that, because it helps you kind of put structure to your thoughts and get things clarified. Whereas if it's all in your mind, it's kind of all over the place and you get different thoughts coming in and coming out. If you have this practice, and obviously you can develop this over the long term by building habits, refer back to some of my other videos in relation to that. At the end of the day, you should have a practice whereby you note down what went well in your day from an Islamic perspective, or even from a dunya perspective. But here we're talking about self-reflection from the Islamic perspective of bettering yourself, getting closer to Allah, making yourself a better Muslim, optimizing your akhirah, inshallah. And it's about, after a while you realize that if you've got your fara'id, you're praying. So this is advice for those who are kind of praying or they're already fulfilling the obligations, right? Then we like to think, or sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking there's too much outside of our control. There's so many things, and it depends where you are in your life. There might be you might be involved in some employment where you can't control everything. You might be involved in certain transactions or relationships where there's loads of haram going on and you can't really control everything. So you develop this kind of negative outlook where you're like, oh, there's too much going on and it's outside of my control. But if you engage in this practice, you'll realize that over time you find patterns. You find it's just like when people keep a food diary, which they recommend if you're trying to lose weight or optimize your health, or even a thought diary, right? You'll find that there's certain things where creatures of habit, we generally live similar days, we work in the same place, we meet the same people, we eat the same foods, we even habitually think the same things, which is why this whole thing about mental health and how it's developed is quite illuminating in that regard, because we develop habits of thought. So if you develop negative habits of thought, dwelling on negative things, catastrophizing, then obviously that trickles down into these long-term health issues, right? So as much as we think everything's outside of our control, over time you'll realize that there is habitual things that you can note down, and you'll realize, when I'm talking to these people, I end up backbiting. When I'm talking to these people, I end up thinking too much about the dunya or competing about the dunya, things like that. So, or you might think other things, like when you're around certain people, when you think certain thoughts, it leads you to this sin. Over time you develop a framework whereby you know, and you can then identify the triggers and make sure you have an action plan to avoid that. Identify the gap between the impulse and the action, right? So you recognize what's going on because you've already journaled on it and you know you're susceptible to this, and then you can act. You can realize, okay, this is what's happening and this is the action that I'm going to take to avoid falling into this kind of sin or falling into this kind of trap. Oh, if I spend this much time on social media or Instagram, or if I browse these profiles, I start thinking about things that don't benefit me, or it kind of shakes my metrics. I might start prioritizing dunya things. What's the root cause of this? Spending too much time comparing myself to others. How shall I address it? You develop an action plan, right? You take back control with the will of Allah. And again, it goes back to agency. You develop that sense of self-efficacy in a way, whereby you have an element of control over your actions, right? So if you engage in this practice, over time you realize you can reduce your sins or your propensity to sin. because you would have, obviously we're always going to sin, and there's going to be new situations where you could act better, but that's part of the process. Now again, you apply that person A, person B time lapse or future projection check, right? Person A is someone who never engages in this practice, and it's just off the cuff, whatever happens, and everything's outside of my control, and the sins everywhere, and inshallah all this. Person B engages in this kind of self-reflection practice day by day, year by year. They're identifying their weak points, they're identifying the triggers that lead to sins, they're identifying steps. It's like this constant process of self-improvement. Where do you think they're going to be after maybe even a few years, or 10 years, or 20 years? Do you understand? Again, it's about these small steps done consistently. How valuable could this be for your deen? There's stories of the pious predecessors, some of them, obviously now we have more kind of opportunity to say things, social media and whatnot, right? The stories of some of the pious predecessors, that they used to write down every word that they would utter. They used to kind of have that level of concern, have that level of control. We know the hadith about how the tongue will lead people to the hellfire. So over time you'll develop this sense of okay, if I talk about this topic, it often leads to me arguing unnecessarily. If I talk to these people, it often leads me to say things that aren't necessary. If I think about these topics, do you get me? So you start developing this kind of understanding of yourself, of your mind, of the way you think. And obviously it's a good practice to have in your kind of toolkit, so to speak. You'll be able to pick up on, sometimes you might have an interaction with someone, you'll go home and you'll go through this exercise. The next day you'll feel this inclination or push to maybe rectify things, apologize if you need to, smooth things over, save yourself from the sin. So yeah, that's the reminder today. If you benefit, share, subscribe. If you have any suggestions for future topics, you can always contact me via my social media. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.